History tells us that civilization collapses because of invasion, catastrophe, or moral decay. That empires fall when enemies breach their walls, when earthquakes fracture their foundations, or when corruption hollows them from within. It is a comforting pattern. It suggests that collapse is dramatic, visible, almost theatrical. It reassures us that we would recognize the signs. But what if the first global collapse did not look like collapse at all? What if it unfolded not as a single cataclysm, but as a quiet unraveling across trade routes, harvest cycles, and bureaucratic tablets? What if the true beginning of global vulnerability emerged at the precise moment humanity believed it had achieved irreversible progress? Around the late second millennium BCE, a network of powerful civilizations dominated the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. They built in stone, wrote in clay, traded across seas, and fought wars with bronze weapons that symbolized technological mastery. For centuries, these societies appeared stable, even sophisticated beyond anything the world had previously known. And then, within a span of decades, they fractured. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, writing systems disappeared, trade routes dissolved, entire political orders vanished from memory. The event has been called the Bronze Age collapse. It is often described as a dark age, a regression, a violent interruption of progress. But perhaps that framing is too simple, because what collapsed was not merely a collection of kingdoms. What collapsed was the first interconnected world system. To understand the magnitude of what happened, we must first enter the world as it was before the fall. In the centuries leading up to the 12th century BCE, powers such as the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Greece, and the Assyrian Empire operated within a shared diplomatic and economic ecosystem. They exchanged letters addressing one another as brother. They arranged royal marriages across vast distances. They traded copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, grain from the Nile, and luxury goods that traveled farther than many people ever would. Bronze itself required interdependence. Copper and tin rarely coexisted in the same region. To produce weapons and tools, states relied on supply chains that stretched across mountains and seas. Maritime trade connected ports like arteries in a living body. Caravans crossed deserts carrying materials essential for military power and agricultural stability. This was not a primitive world stumbling toward complexity. It was a highly organized, literate, diplomatically sophisticated system. Bureaucracies recorded harvest yields. Palatial centers redistributed resources. Armies were professional. Architecture was monumental. From the outside, it resembled durability. And yet, embedded within this brilliance was fragility. The more interconnected these societies became, the more dependent they were on uninterrupted exchange. A drought in one region meant increased grain shipments from another. A disruption in mining affected weapons production elsewhere. Political alliances ensured stability, but they also meant that conflict could ripple outward. Still, for generations, the system held. Conventional explanations for its collapse often emphasized dramatic culprits: invasions by mysterious sea peoples, earthquakes, climate change, internal rebellion. Archaeological layers reveal destruction by fire. Inscriptions speak of foreign attackers. Pollen samples suggest prolonged drought. It seems reasonable to imagine that multiple disasters converged, but here lies the destabilizing contradiction. Disaster alone does not explain systemic failure. Civilizations have endured invasions before. They have survived droughts, earthquakes, and political turmoil. What makes the Bronze Age collapse distinct is not merely that cities fell. It is that recovery did not occur. The system did not reconstitute itself quickly. Instead, complexity contracted, Why? Because this was not the fall of isolated kingdoms. It was the implosion of a tightly coupled network. Imagine a world in which economic security depends on distant suppliers, in which military strength requires imported materials, in which political legitimacy relies on international recognition. Remove a few nodes and the strain spreads. Remove enough and coordination fails. Recent scholarship increasingly frames the collapse as a cascading systems failure. A drought reduces harvests. Food shortages strain political authority. Discontent weakens borders. Trade declines as insecurity rises. Metal supplies falter. Military defenses weaken, raids increase. Trade declines further. Each stressor amplifies the next. No single cause is sufficient, but together they exceed the system's capacity for adaptation. Yet even this system's perspective leaves something unresolved. Because interconnectedness was not an accident, it was a choice. It emerged from centuries of optimization. Centralized palaces streamlined production. Standardized weights facilitated commerce. Diplomatic correspondence reduced conflict costs. Efficiency increased. And with efficiency came dependency. The palatial economies of the late Bronze Age were redistributive. Farmers delivered grain to central authorities, who allocated resources downward. Artisans specialized. Scribes tracked inventories. This structure generated wealth and coordination, but it also concentrated risk. If a palace burned, the administrative core vanished with it. When archaeologists excavate sites like Hattusa or Mycenae, they find destruction layers marking abrupt endings, but they also find something subtler. The disappearance of writing for generations in certain regions. Literacy contracted. Monumental construction ceased. Long-distance trade diminished dramatically. The world became smaller. This is the first global apocalyptic pattern. Not annihilation, but decomplexification. And here is the open loop that unsettles our confidence. If the first interconnected world collapsed because its integration outpaced its resilience, what does that imply about any system that believes itself too advanced to fail? Before we answer that, we must look more closely at the invisible turning point, the gradual shifts that preceded the fires. Because collapse rarely begins with flames. It begins with strain. In the decades before 1200 BCE, correspondence between major powers reveals anxiety. Requests for grain become more urgent. Appeals for military assistance intensify. Some letters speak of unrest in peripheral territories. Climate proxies suggest environmental stress across multiple regions simultaneously. None of these signals alone predicted systemic collapse, but together they formed a pattern that only hindsight makes obvious. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The Bronze Age elites did not perceive themselves as living at the edge of apocalypse. They believed in continuity. They trusted in alliances, in fortifications, in accumulated prestige. Their world had endured shocks before. It simply had never endured all of them at once. What ultimately unraveled the Bronze Age system was not a single invasion or a singular drought. It was synchronization. Environmental stress appears to have struck multiple agricultural zones within overlapping decades. Tree ring data and sediment cores point to prolonged aridity across the eastern Mediterranean. Harvest failures reduce surplus. Surplus is the margin that sustains complexity. Without it, redistribution falters. As grain shipments shrink, palatial authorities face a dilemma. They can tax more aggressively, straining already stressed populations, or they can reduce military expenditures, exposing borders. Either choice weakens legitimacy. In centralized systems, legitimacy is not abstract. It is logistical. It depends on visible provision. At the same time, maritime insecurity increases. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites suggest episodes of destruction and abandonment. The so-called Sea Peoples depicted in Egyptian reliefs were likely not a single ethnic entity, but displaced groups moving through destabilized regions. Migration, once absorbed, gradually becomes disruptive when resources are scarce. This is the invisible turning point. Movement accelerates precisely when states are least capable of managing it. The Hittite capital falls. Mycenaean palaces burn. Trade routes linking Cyprus, the Levant, and the Aegean fracture. Even Egypt, under rulers like Ramesses III, survives only after intense military strain, and its imperial reach contracts permanently. Assyria retreats before later resurgence. The network that once coordinated diplomacy collapses into regional isolation. Yet what matters most is not the destruction itself. It is what fails to return. After 1200 BCE, writing disappears from much of Greece for centuries. Monumental palace economies give way to smaller, localized communities. Craft specialization declines. International correspondence ceases. The technological capacity to produce bronze remains, but its distribution narrows. Complexity does not vanish everywhere, but it fragments. This fragmentation restructures power. Without centralized redistribution, local leaders gain autonomy. Trade becomes opportunistic rather than institutional. Political authority decentralizes. The world does not end. It reorganizes at a lower level of integration. And here the hidden trade-off emerges. The late Bronze Age achieved remarkable coordination through concentration. Palaces accumulated information, resources, and authority. They reduced transaction costs across distance. They enabled specialization and cultural exchange. But they also created single points of failure. When these hubs collapsed, the peripheries lacked independent capacity. Efficiency had replaced redundancy. Redundancy is expensive. It appears wasteful in times of abundance. Multiple supply routes, decentralized storage, and diversified economies reduce short-term output. The Bronze Age system optimized for performance, not resilience. In stable conditions, this strategy generated extraordinary wealth. Under compound stress, it accelerated breakdown. The psychological dimension is equally important. Elites accustomed to stability interpret early warning signs as temporary fluctuations. Bureaucracies built for continuity struggle to imagine systemic rupture. Letters requesting aid assume aid will arrive. Alliances presume reciprocity. Institutional memory encodes survival from past crises, reinforcing confidence. But past crises were local. This one was synchronized. There is a moral discomfort here. Interconnection fosters cooperation, diplomacy, and shared prosperity. It also transmits shock. The same maritime networks that carried copper and grain could carry raiders and refugees. The same diplomatic corridors that stabilized borders created expectations that, once unmet, intensified betrayal. Collapse exposes dependence that prosperity conceals. Over time, new structures emerge from the debris. Iron technology spreads more widely, partly because iron ore is geographically more accessible than tin. Smaller polities experiment with alternative political forms. In the Levant, new identities coalesced. In Greece, oral traditions preserve memories that later crystallize into epic poetry. The world slowly recomposes itself, but it does so differently. The first global system had demonstrated both the power and peril of integration. Its fall did not halt history. It redirected it. The memory of lost grandeur lingers in ruins and myth, but practical adaptation favors flexibility over scale. This is why calling it an apocalypse can mislead. It was not extinction. It was contraction, a recalibration of complexity to match environmental and political constraints. Yet contraction carries cost. Literacy gaps delay administrative sophistication. Long-distance cultural exchange slows. Technological diffusion becomes uneven. Generations grow up without access to the institutional memory that once coordinated vast territories. Knowledge survives, but in fragments. Now the open loop tightens. If the Bronze Age collapse represents the first systemic failure of an interconnected world, its structural logic is not confined to antiquity. Any network that relies on distant inputs, centralized hubs, and synchronized stability inherits similar vulnerabilities. Modern globalization has multiplied these connections exponentially. Supply chains span continents. Financial systems transmit signals in milliseconds. Energy grids interlock across borders. We celebrate this as progress, and it is. Interdependence has reduced certain forms of conflict and enabled unprecedented prosperity. But it has also reduced insulation. The paradox of progress is that solutions to yesterday's limitations create tomorrow's dependencies. The Bronze Age elites believed their diplomatic marriages and standardized trade were safeguards against chaos. In many ways, they were. For centuries, the system's longevity proves its effectiveness. Yet, longevity can breed the illusion of permanence. When strain accumulates slowly, adaptation feels unnecessary. When stressors converge rapidly, adaptation may be impossible. What distinguishes resilience from fragility is not strength alone. It is the capacity to absorb shock without cascading failure. The late Bronze Age system absorbed shocks for generations. It simply had no margin left when multiple thresholds were crossed simultaneously. This reframes the opening contradiction. Civilizations do not collapse solely because they are corrupt or invaded. They collapse when their structural complexity exceeds their adaptive bandwidth. When coordination becomes so optimized that disruption anywhere becomes disruption everywhere. The first global apocalypse was therefore quiet in its logic, even if violent in its manifestations. It was the sound of networks failing faster than they could reroute. We tend to imagine history as a ladder of irreversible ascent. The Bronze Age collapse suggests something subtler, a rhythm of expansion and contraction, integration and fragmentation. Progress is real, but it is not linear. It is contingent. In the ruins of burned palaces, archaeologists find clay tablets frozen mid-sentence, inventories interrupted, correspondence awaiting reply. They are snapshots of a world that expected tomorrow to resemble yesterday. Our world does the same. The lesson is not that integration is a mistake. It is that integration without resilience is a wager. The late Bronze Age made that wager and thrived for centuries before losing it. So we return to the destabilizing question that opened this story. If the first interconnected world collapsed, not from a single blow, but from synchronized strain across a tightly coupled system, how certain are we that complexity alone guarantees endurance? History does not answer with certainty. It offers patterns. And in the silence between burned tablets and abandoned ports, one pattern persists. The more seamlessly a world functions, the more carefully it must prepare for the day it does not.